Hello, bird friends, it's Crowman, and welcome back to my storytelling channel, where I normally post Sims 4 videos with my book characters nowadays in anticipation of the audiobook. I might post a short story soon, though. It's a sci-fi, so subscribe to stay tuned for that. Anyway, today I'd like to talk about some rather common writing advice that I hate, particularly when it comes to writing your first novel. Some of this, you could say, is my autistic tendency toward pedantic corrections, but I'd argue that it's important to poke holes in common writing advice like this because A, there are a lot of autistic people in my audience who take advice too literally, just like I used to do all the time, and B, there are a lot of young writers who also take things too literally or too seriously sometimes. None of the advice I'm about to counter is always bad, but it can get in the way if left unchecked. So today I offer some checks and balances for writing advice that's often taken as law. Number 1. Stop looking up writing advice and start writing. I'd say this one, like all the advice on the list, comes from a good place. You do learn more from taking the actionable step of writing than you do from passively absorbing writing advice. That is true. And while you're taking the time to Google writing advice, well, that's time you're wasting because you could be spending it writing. That's also true. But it's just a touch unrealistic and a touch disrespectful, not to mention you're doing yourself a disservice if you followed this advice to a T, and I'll explain why. First, I'd say it's disrespectful in a way because writers, especially new writers, should be looking for advice from people more experienced than them. I'd love to say that everything you need to write a great novel already exists inside of you, but that's probably a lie. It's a skill that needs to be honed just like any other skill. You're going to want to learn by reading books, both good and bad, and by, you guessed it, Googling writing advice. There's lots of duds out there, don't get me wrong, but writing is subjective. That's the beauty of it. You get to decide what advice is good for your novel and what's bad for your novel. You may even disagree with something I say in this video, and that's perfectly fine. Again, it's all about what works for your novel. Bottom line, that's how you should interpret all writing advice, based on what works for your novel. Also, it's not always reasonable to get writing advice from your friends and family because your friends and family may be readers but not writers. Also, and this may come as a surprise, especially to new writers, but your English teacher probably can't write worth a lick either. The nerve of them to give you grades. Am I right? Now, if you're an aspiring novelist, you probably want advice from people who write for a living. And for a lot of us, the only place to get that reliably is the internet. So that's why I say you're doing yourself a disservice if you never seek out any writing advice online. There's some good stuff out there. Here on YouTube, I recommend Shaylin Writes. I'll link them in the description. They have some great writing advice on their channel. Third, I'd say it's unrealistic because simply this. Say someone is in the mood to Google writing advice. That doesn't necessarily mean that if they weren't Googling writing advice, that they'd be spending that time writing. You don't have to be inspired to write, no, but looking up writing advice is a great way to spend that in-between time. After all, you can't very well write 24/7. Sometimes you have writer's block. Sometimes you're not sure if what you're writing is working out or not, and sometimes your fingers hurt from all that typing. I say that from experience. As someone who was writing like 5,000 words a day at some point, you can't write forever. You can't write till your fingers bleed. It's just not realistic. So I offer this revision of the advice. Don't look up writing advice during time you could be spending writing. Look it up during your downtime instead, and only take it if it works for your novel. Number 2, this is a big one. Never use the word said, or inversely, always use the word said. Both pieces of advice, they're opposites and they're both wrong. Back when I attended elementary school in the mid-90s, using the word said was taboo. We were told that the word said was uncreative and using it constantly was boring. My English teacher even had this huge chart on her wall with words to use instead of said. Some of those words were probably pretty terrible because there were like 100 of them. I remember pausing my precious creative flow every time I stopped writing to reference that stupid chart. So growing up, I thought I had to avoid the word said in order to make an enjoyable novel. Nowadays, most say the opposite is true and that you should always use the word said. And I argue you should mostly be using the word said and use other words more sparingly. So hear me out here. The word said usually flies under the radar, usually. I'll explain that more later, because of how often it's used as a dialogue tag. Kind of blends into the background most of the time. He said, she said, they said. It's practically a long punctuation mark. The reader will breeze through it quickly and move on to the next piece of dialogue without having to rake their imaginations when it's not necessary. Because in most conversations, you aren't shouting, shrieking, retorting, reporting, or whatever. You're just saying or maybe asking it. Shouting is a common one. Whispering is another common one that kind of flies under the radar. But anyway, if you're just having a normal conversation where two or more people say things to each other, it's totally fine and even advisable to use the word said. Other dialogue tags work better when they're used to emphasize some kind of tonal shift from a normal conversation. Like, a shriek isn't very powerful if the character is just shrieking hello or whatever. It's more powerful if you reserve that shriek for when they're being chased by the axe murderer or if they've caught their sugar baby sleeping with the pool boy or whatever. That said, the word said isn't completely invisible like how some writing gurus claim it is. It can get quite cumbersome to have long passages of dialogue with all sentences ending in said. So you can shake things up a little by using action in place of dialogue tags to represent who's talking, or if the conversation is between two people, skipping the dialogue tag every now and then shouldn't hurt. It should be enough to prevent an overabundance of saids, and as long as the reader can still follow what's going on, you've done a good job and you didn't have to shriek anything to keep it interesting. Speaking of shriek, maybe this is just a personal peeve of mine, but how does one shriek out words? Not saying you can't use shriek as a dialogue tag. Edgar Allan Poe did it. But the logistics. Okay. Moving on to point number 3 now. Is write what you know. Now, I get the point with this one. I really do. It's a lot easier to write from experience, and you get more intimate more easily, and there's a lot of good from writing from experience. You know, that's why Elijah has PTSD like I do. That's why Eridie is a goth like I am, and why William is a writer like I am. We love to write what we know. It's easy, but here's the thing about writing what you know. It can get pretty boring, not just for the reader, but for you, the writer. Eventually, you're going to want to write about something you just think is fucking cool, especially if you're a fantasy writer. But luckily, there's an easy revision to this. I propose we change it from write what you know to learn about what you write. How boring would it be if instead of serving active duty in Iraq, Elijah got his PTSD in the exact same way I did? How boring would it be if, instead of being like the goth Paris Hilton or whatever, Eridie was just another stereotypical goth, just like me, I admit. And how boring would it be if, instead of being a writer, William was a writer? How boring. I made William a writer. That is literally the most boring thing I could have done, and I did it anyway, but I was a new writer at the time, so I'll try not to do it again. Not saying you can't have a character that's a writer. It's not always boring. It's just like the one thing in Cry for the Devil that I changed that made it more boring, because originally William was a goth musician and I changed him to be a writer. But anyway, you get the point. I can read about Iraq instead of telling my own story using Elijah as a tool. I can read about the lives of the rich and famous instead of telling my own story using Eridie. And I did that, and it was fun. Write what you know may have been good advice in the 80s, back when you had to go to the library every time you needed to learn something. Oh, God. But we have the internet now. There's so much knowledge at your fingertips that there's no reason you can't write what you love. Excuse me, hiccup. Besides, if I only wrote what I knew instead of learning what I wrote, Cry for the Devil would be a very white story. I don't know what it's like to be a Mexican American, or a Greek American, or Australian, but whatever. I don't know what it's like to be Italian, even. I have mixed cousins, so I have a little baby boost there. But I live in an extremely white area, so what I know is very mayonnaise and Wonder Bread, okay? I don't know. I just feel like write what you know can very easily become an excuse to tell a story with white heterosexual British wizards who never get laid. Number 4 is show don't tell. Now, I genuinely see the point people are making here, just like all these points. Showing can be far more powerful than telling when used correctly, but if you follow this advice too closely all the time, you get a garbage novel. I say this from experience, as the major problem with the OG release of Cry for the Devil is that I implied just about everything with subtext rather than outright stating things. The truth is that you need both showing and telling in a good story. Yeah, not everything will register with every reader. I learned that the hard way too, but just about everything seemed to go above most readers' heads. So when it gets to that point, a writer can only blame himself. So my revision is quite simply to change it from show don't tell to show and tell. Sometimes you need to show things so that readers can feel engaged. Other times you just need to tell things for the sake of your reader's sanity. Outside of English class, most readers don't tend to work hard to understand things. They kind of want it to unfold for them. Now, me, I wrote a book that was begging to be ripped apart in an English classroom instead of one that was easy to understand, and I regret that. Especially since I couldn't afford an editor and readers were judging it the way they would something from a Big Five publisher. I had grammatical errors and stuff that I missed because it's easy to do in a 500-page book, but whatever, that's a story for another day. What I regret is creating a matrix of a character, aka Elijah, and not letting the reader peek into his mind at the end. It's not like you can trust a word that flies out of his mouth, so I'm probably the only person who knows what he's doing and why he's doing it. That's fun for readers who like to analyze. But for most readers, though, that just want to be able to understand a book on their first read without having to put too much thought into it, not so much. Yeah. Rambling, sorry. Now, it's good to tell when you need to pick up the pacing, or when something isn't that important or profound to the story, or whatever, or if clarity is needed. Now, a good time to show would be when you want to emphasize how a character's feeling so that the reader can empathize with them. And it's okay to do both at different times. I think one thing I did well was William's Stockholm Syndrome. I showed it from his perspective, but I told it from the perspective of his captors. And the reason I did it like that is because William wouldn't really know he has Stockholm Syndrome. How would he know? Because he has Stockholm Syndrome. That's kind of the crux of the disorder. He thinks that his captors are his friends. He's not going to register it as Stockholm Syndrome. Whereas from, say, Eddie and Elijah's perspective, they're like, yeah, we gave this kid Stockholm Syndrome on purpose. But, had I not had the perspective of his captors, I'd say most readers still would have figured out that he has Stockholm Syndrome because it's popular in media. It's a rare psychological disorder in real life. Some even argue it doesn't exist. I don't believe that personally. Because how else can you explain what happened in Stockholm if it... whatever. I am rambling. I'm going way off topic. I do this all the time. I write these scripts out and then I don't follow them. So let's move on to point number 5. Kill your darlings. So the advice to kill your darlings is about deleting lines, paragraphs, or even full novels in my case, because they don't work in spite of how attached you are to them. Hiccup, excuse me. Now this is solid advice, I'm not going to lie. If it doesn't work, it just doesn't work, and you shouldn't use it. But actually don't kill it. That's where my revision comes in. Please don't kill your darlings. They're your darlings for a reason, so set them aside instead. For example, I have a scene in my book where I originally wrote Elijah encouraging William by telling him that he is a Mexican, not a Mexicanot. It was lukewarm funny, I guess, but it didn't fit the scene. But instead of deleting it entirely, I sat it aside to use later, and I did end up using it during a scene that wasn't so tense. Is it the funniest line in the world? No, but it has its place, and if I had deleted that line entirely, the second scene just wouldn't be the same. If you want another example, look at the entire book of Cry for the Devil. It has its flaws for sure, flaws that could have been mitigated if I had a team behind me to help me edit that massive book, but I didn't. No looking back now. Well, I guess. See, I loved and adored Cry for the Devil in spite of its flaws, and so did a lot of other people. So instead of killing my darling, I am re-releasing it. The same cannot be said for my first book, Shutdown, which is just rubbish. It never became darling to me the whole time I was writing it, and I guarantee it wouldn't be darling to anyone else, so it's in a literal garbage dump now. It was just unsalvageable. Because you see, if something is darling to you, there's a reason for it. And I promise you, you will have readers who will also find that scene, line, or whatever to be quite darling. So yeah, don't kill it, set it aside. Who knows, even if it doesn't end up having a place in your novel, it might have a place in the next novel you write. And there you have it, 5 pieces of writing advice you shouldn't take too seriously. If you like the kawaii for the devil design that's in the background of this video, you can buy it from the Crowman store as either a mini print or a t-shirt with the lore on the back. Thank you to all my patrons for making it possible for me to make videos on my side channels like this. Sign up for a Discord invite, HDR early videos, exclusive videos, and more. Please rate, subscribe, and blessed be motherfuckers. See y'all.